Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry, I'm 3 minutes late. It's a habit I don't like having. My name's Councillor White, John White. I'm the chairman tonight. On my left, I have Vice Chairman Councillor Jeff Bray. The other councillors who are members of the committee are sitting on two sides of the tables. These are the ones who will deliberate, ultimately vote on each application. On my immediate left and right are TDC officers, including Head of Planning, Planning Manager, and the Council's Senior Solicitor. This is a formal committee, and it's important that the councillors can hear and debate all of the presentations. So I request that you do remain quiet and do not interrupt the speakers. Now, I should say that item 3 on your agenda, it's planning application 19-00610. It's a planning application for Oakmead Road, Point Clear, St Osyth. We have been contacted as late as this afternoon by the applicant and his agent. They wish to defer that item following our site visit this afternoon, and so we'll bring that back. I have agreed that they can defer it and it'll come back to us at a later date. So if there's anybody sitting in the audience expecting to hear that one, it would give you a chance not to sit through all the proceedings and then find it wasn't taken. So the order of business for tonight, as usual, will be, firstly, the officer will give a presentation, then we shall have public speaking, both for and against, and then the parish or town councillor, then the ward councillor, and finally the applicant. Then I go back to the officer for any further comment, and then the committee will do their business, i.e. question, debate, and finally vote on the application. I should add at this stage that, as usual, this meeting is being recorded by the council and it will be available on the council website in 10 to 14 days. So we turn now to the agenda and we start with apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence have been received from Councillor McWilliams and Councillor Codling, and there are no substitutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And then to the minutes of the last meeting, which I think was the 24th of September. Nobody has contacted me to say they found anything wrong. So in which case, can I take them as a true and correct record? Yep. I have nods around the table. Thank you very much. And then we go to declarations of interest. Has anybody got any declaration? We have councillors, yes. Certainly I can see they're both councillors who will be speaking this evening. We have, yes, so Councillor Scott and Alida. Okay. Yeah. Lovely.
Declaring interest on obviously item A4 plan application 19/01261/4, land adjacent to 2 Wivenhoe Road, Alresford. And also item number 5, plan application 19/01353/Outland, Wisteria House, Back Lane, East Street, Bromley. They're my declarations of interest, and I suspect Councillor Wiggins is the same.
Yes. Is that because they're ward councillors?
Councillor, yes, both of these two are ward councillors, although Councillor Scott will be speaking.
With both ward councillors for Alresford Ward.
I was guessing that was the case.
Good guess, though.
Just to clarify,
And Councillor Stock, who is...
Chairman, it's probably irrelevant, but under item 9, there was a comment made by public referred to a planning application which, in which I have a registered disclosure unit for that purpose.
Right, thank you very much. After that, we have questions to the chairman. Now, this is under Rule Procedure number 37, and the question's from Councillor Placey, so I'd ask her if she would turn her microphone on and read the question.
Can I ask the council if the council, using its planning powers, can actually dictate the size of homes, i.e. number of bedrooms, they are looking for in relation to new building? I ask this because expensive large homes are not in the reach of many young people in the area, especially those caught up in private renting, and large 3, 4, 5 beds are not sought after by the growing number of people choosing to live alone. In asking this question, I do not see that homes with fewer bedrooms would adversely affect the number of homes built. Rather, it could increase it. And please note the use of homes rather than houses.
Thank you very much, Councillor Placey. Now, my reply to this is, in developing our planning policy for providing housing choice within the new local plan, the Council produced an objectively assessed housing needs study. This, in fact, identified a need over the planning period for approximately 10% of new homes to be 1 bedroom, with 33% to be 2 bedrooms. Policy LP2 of the emerging local plan states that the Council will work with the development industry to deliver a mix of dwelling types, sizes and tenure, and on major application sites will expect to see just that, such a mix. The Council do need to take into account market demand and site viability. These the Council can expect, certainly on larger developments, a range of dwelling sizes to be provided, and will work with developers to make sure we achieve this. Unless a developer can provide strong viability evidence that the smaller size dwellings are not viable on a particular site, then the Council can choose to refuse the applications if a good housing mix is not provided. Thank you very much. And so now we turn to the first of the applications in front of us this evening. That is application 1801888. This is at Mulleys Farm, Bentley Road, Little Bromley, Manningtree. So I turn to Mr. Faulkner.
Thank you, Chairman. The application before us tonight is an application for the change of use of agricultural and storage buildings to mixed use of B1, which is within office, it's an office use, B2, which is general industrial, and B8, which is storage and distribution. And it's a retrospective part of this application is for the erection of an extension to one of the buildings at the front of the site. Mulleys Farm is in a relatively isolated location. It's not within a settlement area. Obviously, it was historically part of a farmstead. And in terms of the site, the original farmhouse sits to the south of it. And the buildings we are actually talking about tonight are the buildings indicated at the back, a multitude of various historic, well, they're not historic, but there's buildings on the site, various barns and agricultural buildings. And that shows it a little bit more in context. As I said, it's relatively, obviously clearly it's a very built up site, quite well contained. To the north of it, there is a listed building just here, which is a residential dwelling, and beyond there, there's a public house. And obviously, it's more sporadic in terms of residential development to the north of the site. And obviously, beyond that is open countryside. Various views within the site. That's the site entrance, obviously a hard standing to the front of the site, forming the main entrance into the site. Obviously, that shows some car parking to the front of the site. This is a view looking southeastwards from the site entrance. This is a site looking northwest, and obviously, in terms of the site, it's just in here where the cars are parked, and the residential dwelling sits just beyond that. This is the front building to the site, and this prefab building that's actually shown within this actual photograph is the extension that's been built on one of the buildings at the front of the site and forms part of the application before you tonight, retrospectively to retain that particular building. Just going back, obviously you can see through to the back of the site and the various buildings within it. This is a view again from the road frontage. Obviously you can see it was very much an old farmstead type arrangement. Some parking to the front of that building. We will go on to this in a little bit more detail, but this particular building at the front of the site is being used for B2 general industrial use, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in the presentation. Again, a view looking into the site. The building in front of us is the listed cottage. It's obviously independently owned and occupied. Again, a view looking from the front of the site, the cottage being to the left-hand side of that image. This is further back into the site, the various other buildings within the site. Again, a view looking within at the site itself. A view looking back towards the front. Again, obviously you've got the residential listed building sitting there on that right side of the screen. Again, you can see the extension to the building, which is retrospectively looking for permission tonight as well. This shows the various buildings on the site. Essentially, there was a consent back in 2008, July, for a change of use of this site, and that was to allow 6 of the buildings to be used for B8 storage, and 2 of the buildings to be used for B2 general industrial. And in terms of the buildings to be used for general industrial, it was buildings 3 and 4 on this particular plan. The rest of the buildings at that time were to be used purely for B8 storage. Subsequent to that, what has actually happened on what I would add in terms of the B2 elements, there was a condition actually imposed at the time as well, that was specific to a particular B2 use, which was a company called Brick Logic, and they vacated the site approximately 2 years ago. Since that time, this building here, which is marked 1 and 2 on this plan, is now occupied by another B2 use called a Datum Group, and that essentially does various steelworks. So that obviously is in breach of the original consent. They should have been used for B8 uses rather than obviously those buildings there that could have been used for B2. The application before us tonight is to actually widen the permission, one, to obviously allow for that extension to building 1 and 2, that's a small prefab extension, but also to widen the uses on the site so it can be used for either B1, which would be an office use or light industrial, B2, general industrial, or B8, which would be for storage and distribution. This image just again shows the various uses on the site, and as I said, that orange area is a current building that is occupied by this company called Datum Group Limited. The various other buildings are occupied by various uses, relatively low-key. They vary from bicycle parts, storage, and various other uses. I think there's something to do with fishing as well. Various uses for storage at the back, but relatively low-key. That just shows where the single-story extension is. That's obviously been added. showing obviously on that drawing Mulleys cottage to the north. This plan shows the idea of, in terms of how much car parking could actually be provided on the site. And in total, the applicant is suggesting 48 spaces can be provided on the site. Officers believe, on balance, that is an appropriate and acceptable level of parking. Something, obviously, that has been negotiated with the County Council Highways, and they've raised no objection to the application. But I would make members aware, it's a rather odd one, because obviously the whole site could be used for B1, it could be used for B2, or it could be used for B8. If the whole site was used for B8, there would only be a requirement for 18 parking spaces on the site. So obviously with 48, that's well within what can be provided. But if it's actually fully B2 or fully B1, then there will be a deficient number of parking spaces on the site. B2 is relatively close at 52 when there's 48 on the site. But if the whole site was to be used for B1 office accommodation or light industrial, there would be a requirement for 86 spaces, and the quantum here is 48. One of the other issues, is not particularly clear unfortunately from this drawing, is that area there showing a T is just showing the manoeuvring within the site in terms of vehicles being able to turn within the site and come out in a forward gear. Obviously, in terms of enforcement and various matters that have been raised on this site over the last couple of years, there has obviously been complaints about vehicles leaving the site in a rear direction or actually parking on the highway itself. So clearly that has been a concern that has been raised. This just shows again that's a small extension that's been added to the building at the front of the site. And the recommendation, as I said before, members, tonight is a recommendation of approval, but subject to conditions. I would just add, obviously there were concerns raised, and enforcement have been involved in this in terms of looking at the various noise issues from the use of the front of the site, which is Datum Group Limited. That has actually been looked at, and as part of the application process, requirement was that the applicant submit a noise assessment, which they did. And as part of that, that was obviously put before our internal specialists in terms of environmental health, who have raised no objections to it, but subject to the recommendations in the noise assessment. The noise assessment is suggesting mitigation in the form of a 2-metre acoustic fence along the boundary of Mulleys Cottage. There are various other measures actually recommended by their consultants as well in terms of improving the acoustic cladding to the barn doors to the building facing Mulleys Cottage, which is obviously the use for the still use. Silencers being fitted to machinery where possible. White noise reversing alarms will be used on mobile plants where possible, and various management control measures will have to be implemented by way of control condition. Elements of that will be to control speed limits on site to 10 miles per hour, controlling the hours of operation of the site. And with those particular recommendations, and obviously contentions are proposed to actually control the noise levels on the site through condition. The recommendation before you is for approval. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have speakers on this particular case. A member of the public speaking against the application, Mr. Andy Perry, is he here? If you'd like to come forward, sir, get yourself settled, got the microphone on, and then you've got 3 minutes.
Good evening. My name is Andrew Peary, and I'm speaking on behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Christmas, the owners of Mulleys Cottage, the Grade 2 listed property next door to the site. I'm speaking against the application as the evidence provided by the applicant, from which the Planning Department are basing their recommendation for approval, is severely flawed. The noise report undertaken by Sharps Redmore is misleading. It states the test was completed when the barn doors to the Datum Group building were closed, when they were regularly left open, as you will have seen in the evidence provided. Secondly, it assumes internal activity for only 30 minutes of every hour. Again, completely untrue. Based on this, Sharps Redmore made a -3 decibel deduction, but it is clear there is constant noise, so deduction is unwarranted. They took 17 test points over a 34-minute period. They recorded 7 times when noise spiked over 30 decibels above normal background noise. When the report states a 10 decibel increase is a doubling of noise, and an increase of 15 decibels is classed as a severe impact. It concludes that with an acoustic fence, the incorrect assumption that there will be no activity for 30 minutes of every hour, that the noise impact of the site will be 54 decibels, a very cleverly manipulated report. When you consider site behaviour is likely to have been modified during the test, add that 3 decibels deduction back on, and the site exceeds the World Health Organisation's daytime guideline value of 50 to 55 decibels. The Planning Department report also states the application must take into account the effects, including cumulative effects, of pollution on health, living conditions, and the natural environment. The site, nearby dwellings, and the public house have no mains water supply and rely on well or borehole water. The type of heavy industrial activity carried out, namely cutting, grinding, welding of heavy steel, will result in metal particles and industrial chemicals seeping into and contaminating this fragile water supply. The planning report, which recommends approval, states that national and local plan policies support the proposed development for established business, providing the proposal can be accommodated without harming the amenity of local residents. It is very clear that the excessive noise generated from this site will continue to harm the amenity of local residents, and the cumulative pollution generated will continue to have a severe impact on health, living conditions, and the local environment. To conclude, this site is not needed in Little Bromley. It is not wanted. It will damage the environment and will harm the amenity of local residents. The site owner has ignored planning regulations for many years and has been operating the site illegally. On 5 separate occasions, the owner has applied for retrospective planning permission, which highlights the contempt for planning law and any planning restrictions placed upon the site, either at Mulleys farm or nearby Grove Cottage, which is also owned by the same person. I urge you to stand up for the jurisdiction of the Planning Department and local residents affected by it and reject this application.
Thank you very much, sir. And now a parish council representative, Councillor Buxton. Welcome, sir. Same thing applies. Get yourself settled.
Thank you.
And with the microphone, I can see is still on. You have 3 minutes, sir.
Can you hear me? Yes, good. Hello, my name is John Buxton. I'm the chairman of Little Bromley Parish Council. Thank you for the invite tonight. Mulleys is outside of current planning permission, and with an unrestricted B2 class business which has been running for over 2 years, Datum Group. As such, the site neighbours and the village residents' experience of general industrial use class on site is real and actual. The planning application to authorise the current B2 business and also allow further expansion has caused strong negative feedback from residents. As such, the parish council decided to object to the Mulleys application. Our key concerns are as follows. Noise, firstly. Noise pollution has been reported to the parish council from site neighbours and residents in the village. Noise includes dropping of metal girders, metal grinding, forklift movements, lorry loading and unloading. In warmer weather, noise levels are high as operations are carried out with workshop doors wide open. The site neighbours and tendering planning enforcement have visited the site and asked for noise levels to be reduced. Despite assurances, the high levels of noise continues. A noise study was requested by Tendering Environmental Health. The results of the study showed that the noise generated when compared to the background sound is far greater than the maximum required by Tendering Environmental Health. 12 decibels compared to 5, which is 240% over the limit that Tendering Environmental Health requests, and is causing serious adverse effects to the neighbours. The planning report states this is not significant, but I'm afraid the parish council does not agree. The noise study suggests the use of a 2-metre high acoustic barrier as a way forward for the current B2's tenant. But the question is, how can this reduce noise in the direct neighbours' upstairs floors and also for the rest of the village? And finally, what further noise increases will be if there is a site expansion as is actually requested in this application? Traffic as well, the number of traffic movements and the size of lorries from the site far exceeds the estimate provided for the current planning consent in force. The site is located on a narrow, unlit country road with no footpaths. The road is used as the main link between Manningtree, Lawford and the A120. There are traffic hold-ups as lorries turn into and out of sight. When deliveries arrive out of hours, lorries park on the road and wait for access, with other traffic having to pass blind to oncoming traffic. And there's been times when lorries have reversed, large HGVs have reversed into the road with serious accident risk. The amount of verge damage on the approaches to the site and in Little Bromley village has increased. And what further traffic increases will there be again if the site has further extension approved? The parish council believes that this site location is just not suitable for such a business. Finally, hours of operation. The current planning consent and the new application details the working hours as Monday to Friday 7 to 6, Saturday 7 to 12 with no work on Sundays or bank holidays. The current site tenants do not honour this schedule, with work exceeding these hours up to 7 days a week and on bank holidays. As an example, in just the last 2 weeks there have been days where lorries have left at 6 in the morning, and last weekend they were working on site on both Saturday afternoon and Sunday. And final point, the site is lit overnight. High power lights shine directly into bedroom windows of Mulleys cottage next door. This is just not acceptable. If this planning application is approved, current problems will continue, and with site expansion could well get worse. This will cause continued loss of amenity to residents and an increased enforcement burden on Tenbury District Council. Little Bromley Parish Council asks you to refuse this application. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, the ward member, Councillor Stock. And of course, as you appreciate, Councillor, you get 5 minutes.
In that case, Chairman, I will say hello to everyone. Welcome. Chairman, Vice Chairman, members, officers. It's been many, many years since I last came to the Planning Committee. I don't make a habit of certainly of lightly bringing applications to this committee. And when I do, Chairman, it's because I've got grave concerns. This application was only made because of complaints that were made to the Planning Department, and a retrospective application has been forced by effectively our enforcement officers doing their job. As you have heard, the applicant has got takes what has been described to me as being a very relaxed attitude to the planning law, and an even more relaxed attitude to planning conditions when they are imposed, if and when they are imposed upon her. The business in this case, Datum Logic, I think they're called, I've heard nothing but good things about the business itself. Great business. Used to operate in Clacton, I understand, on the Gorsley Industrial Estate, and I don't understand why they moved from there, because that seems an ideal location for a heavy industrial business such as this. I wanted to talk about the noise, because this illegal use of the site was brought to my attention because of noise complaints initially, not by the residents of the cottage there that you've heard about, but by people who live across the road and down the lane, a long way away, frankly, from the site. The noise was intolerable to them, and they're living 100 yards, 200 yards away. The idea that the noise is acceptable is just not credible at all. You're talking about heavy steel works here with incredibly loud noise. The lorries that are coming and going to the site, and I've been caught up several times myself. As you know, I live in the village about a mile away from the site, and I've had to wait 10, 20 minutes sometimes in traffic jams while a lorry is trying to reverse. An HGV, a 40-ton lorry, is trying to reverse back out onto that road, and it takes them 20 minutes to do it. They don't have banksmen to guide them out. They're trying to do it with their ring mirrors, and it's incredibly dangerous. And by the time the traffic frees up, there's 40 cars either side, and it's causing chaos and panic. And that's all times of day and night as well. Very, very early in the morning sometimes, quite late at night other times. So there's two main reasons. I realise that the Essex Highways Authority haven't been particularly helpful on this site, but I can't remember the last time they were on a planning application. But I would just say that, as I say, I absolutely support businesses in rural areas, and I run one myself, but the noise being generated by this one and the vehicle movements from HGV lorries are two key things that make it unacceptable. You've got people living in the very, very close proximity to this business who aren't whingy, moany people who don't want anything in their backyard. They've happily lived there while all sorts of other businesses have come and gone. No complaints at all. They've got on very well with them, absolutely fine. But the noise coming from this business is intolerable, and the vehicle movements are unacceptable. And I would call upon you all to reject this application If it goes to appeal, I'm more than happy that we can defend it at appeal and be successful. But I do think this should be turned down. Chairman, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Councillor. And now call on the agent, Natalie Wisteria, please. Welcome. The same thing applies once you've got the microphone allowed, Natalie, and it's not at the present moment, you then get 3 minutes.
Good evening. As you said, I'm here as agent to the applicant to speak in support of the application. As the application's been brought before you with an officer recommendation for approval, I'm going to keep my comments short. However, I would like to highlight that the site was granted planning permission in 2008 for a B2 general industrial use, used for brick cutting and other brick-related activities by BrickLogic. This was in 2 of the buildings and B8 storage in the remainder, and this had been operational for over a decade. The principle of commercial use on the site is therefore, we feel, in principle, is long established. Over the last decade, the use of the sites has evolved to incorporate small-scale B2, B8 and B1 uses. The application here seeks to regularise the planning permissions to reflect the current uses and provide a reasonable degree of flexibility for the future of the site and the local businesses that it hosts. These businesses provide an important source of local employment and currently provide 12 full-time jobs to local workers. We are aware of local objections to the scheme and provided a comprehensive environmental noise assessment, which was carried out by a reputable local firm called Sharps Redmore. They assessed noise from internal activity, deliveries and vehicle movements, and external activity. And this assessment concluded that current activities do not cause significant impact or disturbance when measured against national standards. Nevertheless, the applicant is keen to implement the recommended noise management plan, which is included in this assessment, including the provision of acoustic boundary fencing to the specifications set out by Sharps Redmore. I'm also aware that one of the main concerns raised by local residents relates to highway safety. As members will have seen when they came for the site visit today, the site gates have been moved further into the site to allow the HGVs to wait off the highway when the gates are closed, and ample turning areas are available on site to ensure that all HGVs leave the site in forward gear. Signs are put up throughout the site to enforce this, and the owners of Datum are also well on board with this. There's ample parking on site to accommodate the current uses, and additional parking could be provided on the adjacent meadow if it's needed in the future should the uses change over time. Finally, I'd like to highlight that the application has received no objections from any statutory consultees, and although the Highways, and including the Highways Authority, who've assessed both highway safety and parking provision. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Mr. Faulkner if he's got anything he needs to tidy up on or needs to challenge or otherwise.
Chairman, not at this stage.
Okay, right. In that case, Councillor Alexander has got his name down on the first list.
Thank you, Chair. Having visited today with the rest of the committee, it was almost in a peaceful and tranquil surrounding with little or no noise, neat and tidy. But the one thing that became very apparent as we went in was the enormity of these massive steel fabrications that were laying on the side. In my mind, these would not be able to be thrown in the back of a transit truck. These needed something of a far more substantial girth, the need of a large flatbed HGV to remove them. I believe that when BrickLogic was given this permission, it was given to them at that time. When I questioned the officer, he said that was correct, and now they have gone. And it appears to me that they are looking for now a retention of what is existingly there and what they're doing with an expansion up to B1 to B2 and B8. The noise from any large metal fabrications is astronomical. And although if you worked in an industrial situation where you were in an industrial estate, for example, the walls and surrounding buildings would absorb the sound as well. Here there is no sound. To that, there is no breakdown to that sound, and it's literally there in a collective ball in the middle of the farm. To that end, after the site visit, I went back and researched this for these acoustic fencing cushions, and to my astonishment, I found that so long as they're within the specified decibel scope as laid down by the councils, the cushions will be more than enough to handle the deadening of the sound, although it won't remove the sound completely. Here we see before us that the assessment concludes that the noise levels from the use of the site are marginally above. How do you define marginally? What does that mean in cold cash terms? What is the actual decibel above? And you've heard from 12 to 5, and they are up into the 12 decibels above the acceptable level. The other thing that I observed was that to look at this on a parking issue. Now let's get it quite clear. I have every fibre of my body wants people to be successful in business and to bring business and to create employment. But it doesn't always necessarily mean that what you're doing is the right place to do it. And in my mind, this is not the right place for this in its present form as we are reading it from this agenda tonight. Chair, we have not been giving any specifics. No one specific building has been said, we want that to do B2, which is the noisy bit, or B8 for storage, or B1, or whatever they wish to do. We've been told there may be a parking for 18, but that could go up to as many as 80. To me, the application before us is inconclusive. It does not satisfy what I consider to be a solid application before us. And in conclusion, I think that if we look at this as a future application, I believe there is mileage here, yes. But I do not believe that this application, as it stands right now, is suitable for the area, for the conditions, and for the people who live in the surrounding village. To me, this is more, they're aiming towards a more heavy industrial unit, and I think that that should be placed in a more industrial area.
Thank you very much. Councillor Bray.
Thank you, Chairman. I concur with a great deal of what my colleague, Councillor Alexander, has said. There are a couple of things that bother me. As a mixed-use site, effectively this site could become entirely B1 or entirely B2. I think we've already established that. That being the case, if it were B2 or B1, the number of parking spaces that have been given to us, and I appreciate we're told there's a meadow, but that's not part of the application, would be substantially higher than those available. So I think that the question I'd really like to ask officers, if this application were for the site to be all B1, would you be recommending approval? Because as mixed, it could be all one. So if the application has said it's going to be all B1 and there's only 48 spaces, would you still be recommending approval? Because that doesn't seem right to me. Is that okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Chairman, in response to that, I tend to agree with Councillor Bray. If it was an application purely for B1, clearly it's contrary to policy in terms of the quantum of car parking. Obviously, in a more urban situation, there obviously is more flexibility with car parking, where there's other means of transportation, but clearly this is a rural location and will be very much car dependent.
Yes?
Thank you for that response, which is nice and direct and honest. So the point then I think is fairly clear. If we give planning permission for this as a mixed site, it could be B1 tomorrow morning, and yet we wouldn't recommend approval if it had been applied for as B1. And that doesn't make a great deal of sense, really, does it? So if that's the case, then we have to assume worst scenario, because it may be that the current owner wouldn't use it as all B1, but what about if the current owner ceases to be the owner 5 years' time, 10 years' time? Once we've given the permission for mixed use, it could be B1, therefore it wouldn't comply with our policies, and so we wouldn't have approved it if it were B1. So I can't see any way past that. The noise issue is also huge. I mean, I've heard several people mention high levels of noise, and we're told that that can be mitigated by a fence. Large girders make a lot of noise, so I would question that. And also, just as a sideline, I wonder if anybody could tell me, I think it was the first speaker suggested that the current applicant has made 5 retrospective applications on this site. Does anybody know if that's correct? Can anyone confirm or unconfirm that for me? Come back very quickly.
As far as I'm aware, no, that's not the case here. The application before you is the first one to actually seek to regularise what's on the site.
Okay, coming back very quickly. Okay, thank you very much for that. I appreciate the answer. That's the information we have. That's what we'll have to go with. I still think it's ridiculous to approve a site for mixed use that then could be all B1 if we absolutely wouldn't approve it as all B1. That is completely ridiculous. And I can't see how we can support it simply because of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. The first thing I'd like to say is that I'm a business owner myself, and I operate my business out of 3 industrial units. So I'm very familiar with the way that they work, and I'm extremely pro-business as a former president of a local chamber of commerce. I'm firmly behind small business and employment. But being a business owner as well, and working out of such units, I'm sort of familiar with the workings of them. And as one of the speakers said, that you know when you work with the doors closed, that it keeps an element of the noise in. But in the summer, and I can vouch for this, you open the doors because it gets really hot inside, and so a lot of the noise which is kept inside will actually come out. So noise pollution will be more extensive during the summer when those doors are open. Now, as any business owner knows as well, that one of the obligations is to carry out risk assessments for health and safety. One of the questions I asked today was, is the site planning on implementing any more lighting on site? And they said no. And to be honest, from what I saw today, and other councillors may agree or not agree, but I saw very little lighting on site at all. And they said that there's no plans for any lighting. Now, there's 2 things there. One is from if there is more lighting that goes there, then there is the light pollution, which is going to take effect. Now, the light pollution will have a great effect on the local houses and also the local business that's there, the Haywain, and will be very detrimental to them. And no fence is going to stop that unless it's about 50 foot high. Now, if there is no lighting, then for me, there are possible health and safety implications, because one of the biggest risks that a site like that has is vehicle movement. Vehicle movement, when you've got vehicles that range between a tonne and 40 tonne, depending on the size of the car or lorry that's going there, can be quite dangerous. And if there's inadequate lighting on site, then it increases the risks of accidents there as well. Now, one of the things that with lorries or plant machinery that may be going about. Maybe there's heavy forklift trucks that are moving some of the steel girders that have been mentioned. And I think one of the speakers mentioned that there will be reversing buzzers going. There is nothing more annoying to a resident or somebody who may be sitting in a pub or restaurant that may be close by than a beep, 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 beep every time something goes into reverse. So noise is a big issue, and I sympathise greatly with the local residents and the local business. And there is an established business there, and I think that we need to ensure that they're not adversely affected by any noise, because it's a pub restaurant, and when you go to a pub restaurant, you normally go there to enjoy your food or drink and sit in a relatively quiet environment, and the last thing you want is crash bang wallop from someone who may be next door. A question for the officer, please, is how many people, I think it may have been mentioned earlier, but how many people actually work there now? What are the employment opportunities, and why the change? What is the need for the site? And I'll come back to you after that, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, in response to the issue of employment on the site, I currently believe it's around circa 20 employees on the site. Clearly, there's no indication what the employment would be if it was purely B1, B8 or B2. Clearly, the B1 use would, by necessity, generate significantly more because it's an office-based employment. Likewise, if it's B2 use, which would be general industrial, obviously there'd be more employment on site, whereas if the whole site was B8, I suspect employment would be extremely low on the site because by its nature, storage and distribution doesn't tend to have largely, it is what it is. I just wanted to come back on a couple of other things. In terms of lighting, if members are minded to support the application tonight, there is a planning condition recommended at condition 5 that talks about notwithstanding any existing flood lighting or other means for external lighting, any further flood lighting on this site or external lighting will need to be subject to agreement with this council. And in terms of the noise elements, you mentioned silencers and obviously vehicles when they reverse, the buzzer sounds. As part of the noise assessment, that is part of the recommendations of Sharp Redmore, their acoustic consultants, that silencers would be fitted to all machinery where possible. Likewise, where there's reversing alarms, it will be to white noise rather than more general noise. And there'll be various other controls. And there, again, there is a planning condition on the recommendation, which is condition number 9, that obviously seeks control of noise on the site. So there are means that this scheme, there will be things they will have to comply with as part of the application.
Yes, Councillor Harris, I'll let you come back on that because there's something that I would want to challenge, I think.
Just to clarify as well, that one of the things that we saw today were a number of cars that had been, well, I don't say dumped there, but they've clearly been there for some time, I would say. There were broken parts, there were axles, there were old tyres. Now, I saw from one of your slides that there was a building there which was had car repairs on it. That, the worry that I have, I mean, I don't know whether it fits into one of these B1, B2 or B8, is that could this at all be grown for motor trade, and could it actually turn into a scrapyard? The last thing that I would ever want to do is to put a scrapyard in somewhere that's a beautiful setting. I'd just like reassurance that couldn't happen. I'm not saying that there's any intention, but I really would like reassurance. And the other thing which one of the members of the public mentioned as well was contamination of the sort of leaching into the water stream or wells, I think they said. I wonder if you could sort of reassure us that isn't going to happen, particularly with old car parts, etc. That has a tendency to really sort of leach into the water table and can cause severe problems, which will cause problems for the environment for many, many years to come.
Chairman, in response to that, if it was to be a scrapyard or something of that ilk, it doesn't actually fall within any of these particular use classes. It's what's called sui generis. So again, that would be breaching. If we were minded to approve this tonight, that would be in breach of this particular consent. One thing, if members are minded to support, and it's not actually referred to here, but clearly if there is an issue of external storage to the B8 uses, again, that's something that obviously could potentially be controlled if that is an additional concern.
Thank you. My question is to do with I mentioned the clause 9, I think you said it was, that the silencers could be put on reversing vehicles. Now, I think that's breaking the health and safety laws. They're not there to attract musical notes. They're there for a specific reason, and they must not, under law, be able to be switched off. But I find that a bit difficult.
So probably slightly misled. What I was actually saying in terms of vehicles that are reversing, it will be what's called white noise. I guess it's a different audible level to obviously. When I was talking about silencers, that's to be fitted to machinery to obviously keep the noise down from general machinery on the site.
Thank you for that. Councillor Fowler.
Thank you, Chairman. I also do share the same concerns as colleagues with regard to the noise, the lighting and the water contamination. But in particular with the noise, I noticed when we were there today on the site with the doors being shut, that was quite noisy. But that type of heavy industrial engineering, I've been on other sites, and of course during the summer months, everything's open. And that noise, it goes up quite considerably. And with the it is a Grade 2 listed building as well. It's only my opinion. Is that I don't think that acoustic fencing would be enough. And we do hear time and time again on this committee from residents in areas with their concerns about these type of application where what our residents have to say, their concerns, they are important. And that's what we're here for. So living in a semi-rural farming area myself, I don't feel that it's right. I don't. And that was confirmed being there today on site. So I would not be supporting the application, but how we would actually go about that, I think there would be a rather long list on that one. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Fowler. Councillor Bray.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I've almost heard enough. You say in the report, if I can just ask officers, you say in the report that the noise level is, quote, marginally above the acceptable level. I think marginally is still above, isn't it? If there's an acceptable level, 1 decibel above is as good as 150,000 decibels above. Otherwise, what's the point of an acceptable level? Chairman, I really think I've heard enough. The B1 issue really concerns me. We could have a whole fleet of developers coming along with big pieces of land. They want it B1. They don't have enough parking spaces. So what do? They make an application for mixed use and use the whole thing as B1. We could set a really nasty precedent here. Don't like it. Therefore, Chairman, I'd like to propose we refuse this application. And the grounds, I think, are that we are marginally above the decibel level. And also the potential for B1 use, which would leave it outside of our criteria. I'll leave officers to put that into sensible language for me. Thank you.
I'll second.
All right, I have a proposal and a seconder, and as Councillor Bray has suggested, we shall need, as it's against officers' recommendation, we need all the facts should it go to appeal. So Councillor Bray suggested 2 immediately, the sound levels in a rural area, and second one was
the potential for B1 use. And
yes, the potential of additional B1 use. Now, anybody else got any further things that you feel? Yes, Councillor Harris?
I know it's been mentioned by other councillors, but certainly the road safety. I think the location is basically in the wrong place, and I think that with those reversing vehicles and the amount of traffic that's going to come out of that, once if it was given the go ahead, would cause issues and highway difficulties and obstructions that could likely be unsafe.
Thank you very much. We're always in a sticky position, as you well know, when Essex County Council highways have no comments to make. But yes, Councillor. Sorry, Councillor. I'm afraid I've downgraded you tonight.
Just with regards, obviously, to the vehicular side, obviously there's slight caution. Clearly, we don't have the support of Essex County Council on higher grounds. They obviously did visit the site and look at the issues of manoeuvring on this particular site. So if we do obviously add that, it clearly won't be with the support of the county highways. It will be obviously a subjective argument at appeal.
Right, Councillor Harris.
I'll just come back to that. I mean, Essex Highways never seem to disagree with anything, really. But what we do have is obviously the parish chair and local residents that actually live there. So for me, that has greater weight, whether that's provable or not. But it certainly does with me, that's for sure.
Sorry, Chair, just so for my clarification in obviously wording reasons for refusal, obviously the first one we were looking at sound and essentially that's amenity issues. I suspect that's to do principally with Mulleys cottage that lies immediately to the north. Secondly, obviously it's the car parking being under standards. If obviously the hypothesis it could be fully a B1 use. And are we saying we want highways-related matters to be a specific, separate reason for refusal?
Yes.
I think so.
Yes, Councillor Harris said yes, and he's also...
Oh, he's got more. Oh, you're on. Hang on. Go.
And also, I think that if the site was given permission and it was all, you've got 86 or however many people that are there, then I think that it could be harmful to an established business, i.e. the Haywayne Public House and Restaurant, because I think it would be detrimental to them.
Can I come back then? Can I come back very quickly?
Yes.
Yeah, I think in support of what Councillor Harris is saying there, also we're suggesting that potentially it could all be B1, at which point there would be 86 parking spaces, so potentially 86 cars plus lorries. And I don't believe Essex County Highways would have taken that scenario into account when they made their recommendation. So I think we do have an argument there.
Sufficient.
Okay, you need to take a vote.
Yeah, I think you've got your reasons.
Right. Well, you had a proposer, you've had a seconder, and you've given the reasons that you think it should be refused. So I'm going to ask you to vote on it now. Those in favour of refusal, please show. And if I put my 2 penneth in, that would be unanimous. So that application is refused. And now we'll move to agenda item 6, which is a planning application 18-00757. This is land to the north of Stourview Close, Mistley, and it's a site well known to us, the number of times we visited it, and it's over to Mr. Faulkner again.
Thank you, Chairman. The application before us tonight is an outline application. It's for a proposed new access road off of Stourview Close and the erection of up to 72 dwellings and associated works. That's not the best plan, but we'll move on to the next. What it shows in context is the existing residential area within Mistley, which is Stourview Close and surrounding streets. A slightly better version of that, so the existing established residential area in Mistley. This is the mainline railway, and obviously beyond that you have the Stourview estuary itself. The access to the site, as we'll see on a drawing soon, will actually come through Stourview Close near to its junction. This is probably the easiest plan to actually articulate that. So the application site, as I said, you've got the railway line to the north, the river estuary beyond that, and the site before us. And as I said, the main access to the site will come from through off of Stourview Close to what will be the residential area within that part of the site there. Before I go on, clearly the site already has an existing extant planning permission on the site, and that was granted within the last year, and that was actually before that. Just bear with me. Yes, that was approved on the 30th of May 2017. So it's still live in a sense. Reserved matters can be submitted on that particular scheme up until the 30th of May of next year. Various views of the site, obviously looking towards the site in terms of Stourview Close, Avenue, sorry. Views across the site itself, the main residential areas. Also shown a various landscape here on the site. This is a view from the Stourview Close itself, looking north towards the site, which is beyond. That's you can just see the hedgerow line through there, so the residential scheme is beyond that. Obviously you can see it's a relatively sloping site, various landscape features in and around the site. This is a view looking back towards Stourview Close to the south. Another, just various contours of the site. This shows in a little bit more detail the access obviously coming through off the Stourview Close to the eastern side of that. The scheme just showing the utilities across the site. So in terms of the actual articulation of the scheme, this is purely an illustrative plan to show where the development parcel will be. As I said, there will be a principal new access into the site off of Stourview Close, various landscape features around that, and the principal residential area is actually shown in blue within that area there to kind of the northwest of the site behind Stourview Close and the various existing residential. So the scheme before us tonight is a revision to that scheme. It is proposing an additional 2 dwellings, so it will actually increase it from 70 dwellings up to 72. But the principal change from the previous scheme is obviously in terms of financial contributions. As part of the outline permission that was granted in 2017, there's a suite of measures that were proposed in terms of elements including education, which would be a contribution up to about 770,000. On top of that, a contribution towards medical facilities, which was an additional 21,700, and a habitat contribution of 3,000. So it was circa about 800,000. Obviously, subsequent to that, the applicant has obviously gone away and looked at the scheme in more detail in terms of how it will be brought forward. And in terms of that, various infrastructure costs have been reported in terms of their submissions. There's significant additional costs derived largely from various components, but these actually include the relatively long access road, which is required into the site to serve a relatively small number of units. It will have to, the access road itself will actually have to cross a spring, and that will lead to significant geotechnical design and construction work. The route of the access is parallel to a stream and is suspected to be, there's question marks about its stability, so there will be need for further investigation and design work to address that. Where the road crosses a stream, a substantial culvert structure will be required. Modelling of the stream needs to be undertaken to understand the flows. and it says there's no straightforward locations in which to site the attenuation basin. The best location is shown to be in the northeast of the site where I'm circling now. But to actually deliver that with the sufficient slopes and gradients will actually require quite a significant engineering operation to create that basin. The site levels mean that some parts of the site cannot be drained by gravity, so there will be a need for a pumping solution on this site. There will be a need for retaining walls across parts of the residential site because of the challenging site levels. And due to the proximity of the adjacent railway line, the project may need Network Rail to sign off and retain funds to underwrite development of the site. And design fees are likely to almost double or be equivalent to a similar sized project on level ground. So as part of this application, the applicant commissioned and we're required to submit a financial appraisal with the application. And as obviously a council, we employed external consultants to review and look at that report. There's been negotiations ongoing for some considerable time on this. And what has actually been resolved at the end of that process is the scheme, because of the various requirements and mitigation required on this site, can only deliver circa 260,000 of contributions from this particular development, whereas the scheme before you, which was approved in 2017, would have delivered a package of more, circa around 800,000. As I said, that was for education, healthcare facilities and habitat requirements. And on top of that, there was a requirement for 5 gifted affordable units on this site. So the package before us now is only actually going to deliver obviously a quantum of 260,000 and no affordable housing on this particular site. From the officer perspective, clearly we've looked at this in length and clearly we are led by our external consultants in terms of the financial appraisal. And obviously from what they have come back to in terms of their recommendation, they consider it a robust and a reasonable requirement that the scheme can only be viable at that quantum of 260,000. And the recommendation is for approval. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Now, there is a point, but I'll call the agent, Mr. Will Vogt, to come forward if he will. There are no other members of the public speaking, so Mr. Vogt, you've been here many times before us and you appreciate that once you've got your mic live, you've got 3 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee, for allowing me to speak in support of this application. You've read in your report and heard from your officers that the principle of development is already established by virtue of the outline consent granted in 2017 for 70 homes. Furthermore, the site lies within the draft settlement boundary for Mistley, where residential development is promoted. This is a material planning consideration of significant weight, which reinforces your officer's recommendation for approval. At this point in time, the Council cannot demonstrate a sufficient supply of housing. It therefore places an extra emphasis on the need to get building and help developers to help the Council to help the people who need a home. Since the 2017 permission was granted, technical reports have been prepared to tackle various engineering issues. As you will have seen from your site visits today, the site is relatively steep and includes a small stream. It is also adjacent to a railway line and the sewer crosses the site. These factors require specific engineering solutions, such as retaining walls, water attenuation ponds, a pumping station and a culvert over the stream. Fortunately, these straits do bring some silver linings. Indeed, here the constraints mean that about 30% of the site can be classed as public open space, well in excess of the 10% figure normally sought by the Council. This open land brings specific wildlife and landscape benefits. We can also provide 2 extra homes to count towards the Council's housing target. Crucially, the scheme is now viable. Rose Builders are a local business. We pride ourselves on high-quality homes and a range of sizes and for doing a good job, and we're looking forward to getting on with delivering another fantastic site here. Therefore, I conclude by respectfully asking you to approve this resubmitted application in accordance with the recommendation of your officer's report and the findings of the Council's independent valuer. This will crucially allow for homes to be delivered on a site that has already been proven to be suitable for housing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vogt. Before we start I should ask Mr. Faulkner, is there anything to add or comments first?
The only thing I'd add, I would collaborate with what the applicant has actually said with regard to the settlement boundaries. In the emerging local plan, this site is taken out of what would be the countryside and would form part of the settlement of Mistley. Whereas in the adopted plan, clearly more historic, this site would obviously be deemed to be countryside.
Thank you very much. Now, this morning, one of the questions were raised because TDC own the land at the start of this development, and therefore, in crude non-planning terms, that means, as far as I'm concerned, we hold a ransom strip there. And also, as TDC are the owners, should we be deciding on an application which is effectively ours already? So I'm going to ask the solicitor, who was briefed that this question would come up, if she'd like to give us her views.
Sore throat, this could take a minute.
Thank you, Chairman. So, committee, as has been pointed out, the council does own a small but important part of the land that forms within the application, which is as I understand it, the access point. As a principle, if any of the councillors owned that piece of land privately, then you would have to declare interests and you wouldn't be able to take part. Because the council as a whole owns the property, you often have applications before you which are either on council land, which are on council land. The committee's function in relation to local planning authority is separate to that as landowner. So we talk about executive and non-executive functions. So you're perfectly able to make a decision on this application without having to declare any additional interest. And the protections that we have in place regarding applications which involve council ownership is that they couldn't be decided under delegated powers. They are always brought to the committee, so it's the decision is made here rather than at officer level. So in summary, you don't have to individually declare any interests. The report acknowledges that we have got the council does own part of the land, and that's specified and is made clear. I checked with the property department before coming over here this evening, and the negotiations in relation to the ransom slip are, although they're irrelevant to this committee's decision tonight, the negotiations did stall some while ago. So if the planning permission was approved this evening, then those negotiations would recommence, and then a report would be taken to Cabinet in relation to that land deal, as it were.
Thank you for that. Councillor Bray asked to come first, and then Councillor Alexander.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I said this morning that given the engineering complications with this particular site, I'm a bit surprised anybody would try and develop it at all. There seem to be more complications than anything else within it. What concerns me, I want this clarified as clearly as possible, is not the actual site or the development, which frankly doesn't look too terrible at all. It's the 106 contribution and the affordable housing that is a problem for me. As I understand it, the original suggestion was around about 800,000 as a contribution circa, and I assume that would be normal for this size of site, and that would be for various things, education and the array of things it's normally for. Given that the developer is now only offering 260,000, are we then expected to ask our council taxpayers to provide the other 540,000, or circa that amount, which doesn't seem particularly reasonable to me? Simply put, it looks to me as if the developer gets an extra 2 houses from this and maintains their profit margin of around 17%. We get no affordable housing and an extremely large bill for our council taxpayers. I find that extremely difficult to swallow. Can you tell me if anything I've just said is not absolutely correct?
Chairman, in response to that, clearly when the original application was before you, yes, that was a consideration, that obviously they were the requirements. If you were to apply this policy specific, and that's why that scheme was actually approved, those 4 requirements were sought. And clearly, if members are minded to support this application tonight, clearly that sum of 260,000 will have to be spread either towards affordable housing, and the whole sum could be used towards that, or it would have to be split evenly across the various uses. But you're right, in terms of the contribution towards education, there will be a significant shortfall to where it was in terms of child yield, and obviously those places will have to be obviously financed from elsewhere.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for that. That clarifies exactly what I thought. So the situation as I see it then is that we are asking our council taxpayers to use circa £500,000 of their money from their purses and their wallets to underpin a development that is, shall we say, at best difficult, in order that the developer can maintain his profit. You won't be surprised to hear me say that I'm going to struggle immensely to support that idea. Thank you.
Councillor Alexander.
Thank you, Chair. Just a point that Councillor Bray raised when looking at the recommendations, if we are so minded to approve at the head of planning, etc. And one of the 3 bullet points down were financial contribution towards affordable houses, financial contribution towards RAMs. From what I've read in this part, it seems to be contradictory to what's within the recommendation. Does that mean that that recommendation will have to be changed? Chair, that's the first part, and I'd like to come back on something else, if I may.
Chairman, yes. Sorry, in response to that, clearly, yes, in terms of the habitat regulations, this scheme would have to be fully compliant with the requirements of the habitat regs in terms of the RAMS contribution. So I think that works out, I believe I said, circa about 30,000 of the total quantum would have to be set aside for that to obviously meet the habitat regulations in terms of mitigation. It would be the remaining sum that obviously could potentially then be used for the affordable housing.
Right. Do you wish to come back, please? Yes.
Right. Chair, we're just scanning through this enormously long agenda and quite in depth. Things that sort of jump out at you as this constants of lack of school provision, doctorate, healthcare, education. It just goes on and on and on. Also, it stands in an area of outstanding natural beauty. We've already given such permission for the 70 properties. And I do agree with Councillor Bray on this, that having some experience in the distant past with the use of a pumping system to remove unwanted slurry about, it's all very well and good until things start to break down, and then it's not quite so funny, and repairs can be somewhat hazardous. So I quite admire them for wanting to go ahead with it in its present form. I am concerned by it, and there are certain issues that we need to address. Where our responsibility is to look at the application from a planning perspective, and yet we are given these details in which we are supposed to peruse also as consultees, external consultations. Looking at them, we should or we shouldn't be taking any notice of what they've got to say. If so, there is a dramatic lack of education in schools within the area in which they're going to this proposed building. I don't, as I say, transport is not an issue, which quite surprised me, to be honest with you. So I'm having difficulty with this application, exactly the same as what Councillor Bray has. Thank you, Chair.
Well, I'll take Mr Harris in a moment. I've just got a query, as it's been mentioned, education. Looking at the figures, Essex County Council want 330,000 for primary education, 394,000 for secondary education, and that crudely comes, if my maths are vaguely right, £664,000. Now, what happens if we were to give permission for this and the applicant has said, well, I'll give you 260,000, who finds the other 400,000? Is that another additional item that falls on us, on TDC to pay? That worries me, especially the clause 2, and that's only for classes. But if they have to build additional classes, then there'll be a further figure for transport, pushing the children to the different schools because they can't be dealt with in the local schools. This money situation worries me. It really does worry me. Regardless of the builders, and we all know that the Rose are excellent builders, but to me it doesn't add up financially now. So perhaps the officer might comment on where the missing money comes from for Essex education.
Thank you, Chairman. It's probably a rather difficult one to answer here and now. My experience of such matters, clearly there is a legal obligation on, obviously, the County Council to, obviously, fulfil the needs of children to find places for them. But as you rightly say, it would have to come from some financial source. The starting point, I suspect, would also be Essex County Council. But clearly, if you work back in terms of council tax, clearly part of the council tax is an Essex County Council contribution. So obviously, if a number of the schemes over time were allowed in such form, then clearly that would have to be reviewed to facilitate additional growth in this way. So I don't dispute that. Obviously, there's a legal obligation to find children's places at schools. But obviously, the ordinary, the natural way that that's generally done is through mitigation, through contributions. And clearly, in this particular case, we won't get those contributions. I would just, though, obviously go back on where the starting point here clearly is there was a scheme that has been approved on this site for 70 dwellings. And clearly, that scheme, if today we decide not to support this application, the risk is that this site will not come forward, and clearly that particular 70 units in terms of our 5-year land supply and moving forward in terms of calculation will obviously be lost. That's something obviously to consider here.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to challenge you as an officer, but my recollection was we were recommending acceptance of this site provided that the Section 106 agreement was signed, and my understanding is it wasn't signed, and therefore you can't say that approval's been given to the site. Am I right on that?
My belief that outline consent has been granted on this site for that scheme. As I said, that was approved on the 30th of May last year, and that would obviously have to be subject to a Section 106 agreement.
Right. I'll have to look at that one. Councillor Harris.
Thank you. Well, you've just said a number of things that I was going to say, actually. But, I mean, this has been going on for some time, almost as long as the EU referendum, I think, when this first came about. But perhaps not that long. I'm not sure. But this is all stacked around sort of the viability of this site here. It's a real sort of shame or disappointment that we haven't got sight of the actual viability report, and that we perhaps haven't got a person here who can actually really go into detail we're going on sort of assumptions or a view of that report, but it would be really good to look into that. Many of the points that I was going to make have already been made, but it's absolutely clear that there is a need for commitment to education, for health, and what was the other one? Health, education, and affordable housing. That was the other one. Thank you very much. That was the other one. Sorry. And I mean, look, just reading here on page 67 of this report, it says a development of this size can be expected to generate the need for up to 6.3 early years and childcare places, and 21 primary school and 14 secondary school places. Then goes on to talk about the funds that are required from there. Page 68, a developer contribution of £21,000 is required to mitigate the capital cost to NHS England. NHS England requests that this sum be secured through planning obligation linked to any grant of planning permission in the form of Section 106 agreement. And if we turn over to page 84, which is the sort of conclusion really of the November 2016 when it came before the committee then, and the last paragraph, and really sort of comes back on what the chairman just said. And I'll read 6.77. In the overall planning balance, officers consider that the adverse impacts do not significantly or demonstrably outweigh the benefits, and the application is therefore recommended for approval. Subject to a Section 106 legal agreement and a range of planning conditions. And I believe that was key at the time that was approved, and therefore we can now say that the Section 106 has not been fulfilled, and therefore I really think that brings in the whole question of whether that permission should be granted, as they haven't fulfilled the Section 106. I also think as well that to go back onto the affordable housing, where it states that our new sort of emerging plan, it dictates that there should be 30% of any new sort of housing development. There should be 30%, but in sort of exceptional circumstances, it may drop to 10%, and yet we are being asked to accept 0%, and that's really hard to swallow. That's not looking after our residents here. It's also putting a huge ask on taxpayers here who are going to have to fulfil that. And then somewhere in this report already, it actually said that the council was already contributing half towards those education costs anyway. And now we're going to expect to pay all of it by the looks of things. I don't think that's acceptable, and I won't be supporting this application.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Fowler.
Thank you, Chairman. I remember the application from 2015 with the 70 dwellings. I do remember that one quite well. And I also agree with Councillor Harris regarding the viability study. I mean, that's something I would be quite interested to see in some further detail. And where I think we have also a fly in the ointment now is that the viability study was looked at by the council's independent consultants, which it would be somewhat foolhardy for the council not to take notice of the advice from the independent consultants. So quite where we go from there, I'm not sure, but I do agree with colleagues regarding the amount of the 106 monies for education and health and affordable housing. I'm still on the fence on this one, but I think where it leaps out at me on the page with the council's independent consultants giving the advice on that one, I think that's quite an important piece of information. But I would like to see that viability study in further detail. So I don't know whether we might go down the road of deferment on that one if we're able to. Chairman, thank you.
Good. Unusually, we were issued with the actual planning application of 17, a copy of it, and you'll see on page 57, which is where I got my information from, that it is quite specific that we granted planning permission for the development subject to, and then it lists the items: education, health, contribution towards the ecological mitigation, and completion of the transfer of public open space, which we were talking about earlier. So in my mind, that means there is no outstanding permission. It hasn't been taken up. Now, if you then refer to page 37, third paragraph, I think it is, Essex Education say that it should be noted as an additional reason for refusal is on the question of the transport, and so they are expecting to be consulted if it went to appeal. So they themselves are not happy, but it does add fuel to the fire. Councillor Bray, did you wish to say something?
Yeah, I'm just really to support what Councillor Harris said. I see a situation here, and it's already been said, we're very good developer. We know the developer well. They're very, very good at what they do. But nothing on earth is going to persuade me that I should throw a circa £500,000 bill at council taxpayers. So, like Councillor Harris, I'm just not going to be able to support this. I'm sorry.
Right, although it wasn't a firm proposal, but I think she might take it as a firm proposal. Councillor Fowler indicated that she thought that more investigation was needed, and we might deem to defer this item for the extra information. Does that get her blessing, if I've interpreted it correctly, and do I get a seconder for that? Councillor Harris?
No.
No, he wouldn't, right. Then do I have a seconder for it? No. Right, in that case, the floor is open again for looking for other proposals. Councillor Harris this time.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify something, which is regarding the NPPF. At the time that this application was made, there was no stipulation that the developer had to do the survey before they put the application in. Is that correct? But I understand that the NPPF 2018 requires that before they put in an application, that this viability study needs to be done up front. And in which case, that had this application come about now with this information, it's likely to have been turned down, surely.
Chairman, just in response to that, you're correct. Clearly, the application that was before you previously, the applicant was comfortable with meeting the various forms of mitigation. That wasn't part of their application at the time. They were fully policy compliant in terms of education, healthcare, affordable housing. In terms of what's now before us, yes, for them to actually now revert to obviously a less financial offer, clearly they have to do a viability appraisal as part of this current application. And that's for us to weigh up in the planning balance whether that is appropriate to support the application or whether members don't support what is being recommended before us today in terms of a lesser sum of money and should be refused. So in terms of what was before you previously, the applicant was suggesting they could fully meet the requirements, so there wouldn't be a need for a viability appraisal at that time for that reason.
Right, Councillor Harris, and then I'll take Councillor Alexander.
So what I can assume is that at the time they made the original application, that it was a business risk. They took the assumption that it would go through. They took a business risk that it would be okay, but that risk has backfired, and it's turned out that it's not viable. And for me, that, you know, because of the findings of that, it makes this unacceptable. and I propose that this is not deferred, but I propose that this application is refused.
Thank you. Councillor Alexander, do you wish to join in before I ask for a seconder?
Chair, understanding the procedure, would you do the seconder first and then I'll come in on the side if I may?
Right, okay. Do I have a seconder? I do. Councillor Placey. Right.
I'm a little concerned by this, I've got to be perfectly honest with you. First and foremost, I think an officer's statement was that it is the obligation of Essex County Council to provide school places and the provision thereof, and I believe that was said here. Tonight in this room, yes it was, but where do you think Essex County Council derives its money from? It doesn't derive it wholly from the government. Sometimes it takes people like us to put our hands in our pocket and start paying out. So with that, I thought we needed to get that cleared up as well. The developers we've known for some considerable time. They're good developers. I'm concerned that we need these developments. We need them. It's trying to play to a to middle ground, to try and find a place that we can go to on this. The whole thing seems to issue around the financial contribution that has been offered. We're big enough here as a committee to be able to make a decision on a final base, but reading this small part, which is on page 31.2, therefore concludes that the proposal scheme can support a payment in lieu of some 2.26. The actual report, I've not seen this report. I don't know how they derived that report and how they came to that, nor the conclusions of it. If we're man enough, or lady enough as well, as a group, as a collective group, to stand here and make a decision on whether we should accept or refuse this application, then surely we should be able to look at these kind of reports to find out how they end up on the agenda before us. It appears to me that we're only getting a part of the solid picture. I wish now that I'd second the deferral. I really do, because I think that would have been the right direction to go and to take it back with more discussion. Too late. It's gone. I've lost it. So my conclusion is that I'm not going to, I'm sorry guys, but I am not going to vote against this application as it stands. It's not enough.
I have a proposer and a seconder for refusal. It could be that the proposer or seconder might withdraw it. Otherwise, I'll take a vote on that, and then if that is lost, then I will come back and we can review it for that suggestion. No further comments on that? No, right. Then the proposal for refusal is in front of you. Those in favour of refusing? 1, 2, 3. Those against refusing? 3. For the first time, for the first time in all my chairmanship, I've been asked for the casting vote. I am very reluctant, but I am going to go against the proposal, i.e. I'm going to not stick with the refusal at this stage, so I should be voting against it. But then that will mean there are 4 against the proposal and 3 for, which means it's lost. So that then goes to the other proposal, which I had across here, and I have a seconder for that one.
I will second that. If the proposal is prepared to still go ahead. Yes, Chairman.
Yeah. This would mean, if you vote for this, that we want access to all the financial documents that were sent, which is very unusual, but it could have a bearing on the ultimate decision. So those in favour of deferring it, please show. That will be the four of us. Those against deferring it. Those abstaining, 1, 2, 3. So the vote that has it is for deferral. Thank you very much. We expect it to come back hopefully very soon with all the documents attached so that we can have a look. Just ask the officers if they have any comments to make after we've made the decision. But,
Can I? Sorry, Chairman, can I just check for clarity whether the deferral is to simply bring the matter back to committee with more information regarding the viability, or whether you wish further work to be done with officers on the viability? Do you just wish the matter to come back here to another meeting with more information? That's this sense I'm getting.
yeah, I'll look at the proposer and seconder.
Chair, that's not exactly how I read it, although I might have had a senior moment and missed something in the process of the monitoring officers speaking there. The idea is that I would like to see the chain of events by which this exterior body came to us. Is that what you were saying? Oh, stupid thing. That this exterior body brought before us this 2.6 blah blah blah. I'd like to see how that came to bit. I'd like to read how they decided that, and I think that we would all be interested in, because I think that has a great bearing on the financial part of this, which appears to be why this has been very nearly rejected.
Answer the questions. Yes. Yeah, Head of Planning indicates that would be satisfied and that could be provided. So that's what we are really looking for. Right, and so it has been deferred. I think so. Yes. Yeah, we'll have a 5-minute comfort break.
That's a very good plan. Delivered. It's been delivered. We're fine.
Right, let us let's get back to the business of the evening, and that is planning application number 1901-261. This is for land adjacent to 2 Wivenhoe Road, Alresford, a site which we are again very well, we've been here several times. So, Councillor Faulkner's going to do that. Councillor, I've raised his grade already. Mr. Faulkner is going to bring this one to us.
Thank you, Chairman. The application before you tonight is, as you say, for a residential development of up to 3 dwellings. Members are relatively well briefed on this site in terms of the chronology of planning applications that have been before you. The plan before you there shows the current application in terms of a reduced area of the site. I will go on and actually explain that the previous applications, which obviously covered a wider part of the site, obviously the blue land there shows the wider land ownership. The application before us is an application for 3 dwellings, obviously in a linear form at the end of Wivenhoe Road. Slightly blurred site aerial photograph there for some reason, but obviously it shows obviously the junction there of I think that's Alresford Road, and this is Wivenhoe's Road, and that's where the access to the site will actually come in. This plan before you, it shows the development plan. The adopted plan shows the site is actually outside of the residential area of Alresford, not Alresford, and Alresford. I knew I'd get it wrong. I was waiting for that. So. And this shows the emerging plan, and obviously that one shows it within the settlement area. Various photographs. This shows the junction, obviously going into Wivenhoe Road itself. The application site entrance is just beyond and behind that sign into the settlement area. Where the blue car is in that, well, a blurred image again, but that is the access into the site off of Wivenhoe Road. This is a view looking back towards Wivenhoe Road and St Joseph Road as well, as the site turns the corner. A site, again, this is looking from Wivenhoe Road as you enter the site, and as you can see, it's currently a paddock area. To the right of that image is obviously quite a long and delineated hedgerow boundary, and that is with the existing neighbouring property on Wivenhoe Road, which is number 2 Wivenhoe Road. So that hedgerow I just showed was delineated along that eastern boundary of the site. This plan before you is the scheme that was before you last year. And that, again, was the first scheme of 3 dwellings, but it was critically for a larger tract of the site. So obviously, in terms of the site, it was a larger area. It's still the same in terms of the residential entrance to the site and access arrangements. The plan before you there was the street facade, or street elevation for the scheme that was approved last year. Showed 2 dwellings of relatively same format on the eastern side of the site, but a larger, more detached unit with more car parking on the left-hand side of that. And that was obviously turned down by members in terms of overdevelopment of the site, and was subject of an appeal that was turned down quite recently. And that was principally to do with the scale and form of the development being out of character with the area. Unfortunately, I haven't got wider images of Wivenhoe Road before you tonight, but in terms of the character of Wivenhoe Road, it very much is made up of a linear form of development, kind of sporadic and not uniform. It's made up of bungalows, some houses, and a lot of chalet form of development as well. So that scheme before was considered out of scale, obviously more in the form of 2-storey houses. And just before we go further, that was an earlier scheme again before that, which actually approved 1 dwelling on the site. So there is an extant permission on the site for 1 dwelling on the eastern side of the site next to number 2 Wivenhoe Road. This now shows the elevations. Here we go. So this is now the proposal before you for obviously a reduced scale of scheme in terms of obviously a reduced site area. The plots are now more in keeping with what you actually find along the northern side of Wivenhoe Road in terms of plot widths. So very much looking to make a more uniform scheme. The dwellings have been pulled forward to be more in line with dwellings along Wivenhoe Road itself. And as I said, the actual plot widths are more in character with what is actually before you in terms of what's on the ground at the present time. These are various elevations. That is plot 1, which is the one furthest to the west of the site. So that will be the end dwelling as you read it. And then moving, that's the footprints there. And obviously showing a 4-bedroom dwelling. And then moving to the middle plots, very much a chalet form of development, very much with articulated gable roof dormers, and that will be followed through at the back of the dwellings as well. As you can see, the eaves heights have been pulled down here as well to actually very much make it 1.5 rather than 2-storey development on the site. And very much mimicked again in terms of the plot nearest number 2 on the eastern side of the site. Again, very much more a chalet form of development than the previous scheme. This just shows it in terms of the form, in terms of how it would read on the street scene. And as you can see, it's very much more uniform with what you would find in terms of the existing character along Wivenhoe Road on that northern boundary. This plan is just to show the comparison between the refused scheme, which obviously was dismissed on appeal, The black dash line there is actually showing where that compares with the existing application, so that is now the new red line boundary. So obviously development has been pushed further to the east of the site. And this is just showing a comparison between the scheme that was refused last year and dismissed on appeal and not what is now before you. Clearly it was more two-storey in form through the previous application, obviously a significantly larger dwelling at the end, at the western end of the site. And just in terms of comparison, in terms of ridge heights, this was 8.6 metres to the ridge of the roof, whereas the scheme now before you has reduced that down to 8 metres, and it's a uniform 8 metres across all three plots, which is, as you can see from that, very much more akin with what you actually find on Wivenhoe Road. One update today, which actually isn't on your update sheets, but was drawn to our attention this afternoon by a councillor, was with regard to the archaeology. The previous recommendation on the refuse scheme 181381 did include a requirement from County Archaeology for a programme of archaeological trial trenching to be carried out. Having spoken again with County Archaeology this afternoon, it is an error on their part that for whatever reason the same officer had a different recommendation, but clearly it should have been the same across both schemes. So if you are minded to approve the application this evening, there is a recommendation that an additional planning condition is actually added for a programme of trial trenching for this site. The recommendation is for approval. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Speakers now, Parish Councillor Ernie Osborne, if he would come forward. Welcome again, Mr. Osborne, and you're very conversant with our system.
And
you've got 3 minutes,
yes.
sir. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all again. We had a site visit this morning, actually, which rather highlighted a lot of what's been going on. If you were in France, it'd be déjà vu. If you're in America, it would be Groundhog Day, because we've gone over and over this site again and again and again. Initially, this site had an application for multiple housing. It now seems that we're back to multiple housing. The only reason that this particular site got approval for one particular house was it was agreed by the council that if the applicant were to build I called it a hobbit house, sorry, an eco-friendly house. If they were to build that, and it would then fall in line with the rest of the scene of that particular site, then that would be acceptable. So that in fact got approved. But the only reason that particular application was in there was not to build a house. The application was in there so that the then landowner, could sell the land with a planning application, and that's what's been going on here. An awful lot with regard to this plot. The applications have been going in. We've already had approval for one house. Okay, fair enough. The one house was approved, but nothing's been done about it. But no, what they want to do now is to build 3 houses, going back to multiple once again. Now it doesn't end there, because we can see by the land there that this particular landowner owns. There could be several more applications on top of this one, taking it along the line even further. I think we've heard this time and time again on this site, and you've gone forward and asked for this to be approved. Yet you've been duped so many times on this. We don't seem to be recognising the implications of keep approving these particular houses. Notwithstanding that, it suggested that the house is within the development area, which of course it isn't. It's only on the new local plan that it's in there, and it was only in there simply because of the eco house. So I don't think that holds any water. And with regard to the site as well, we've got our own neighbourhood plan now, and this neighbourhood plan states quite categorically that only houses within the settlement boundary will be accepted in Alresford. So this has got to be recognised now. So I'm going to leave it there, Mr. Chairman, if I may. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Councillor Scott, the ward member.
Good evening, Chairman, councillors. It's been a while since I've approached the committee, but good evening anyway. Councillor Osborne has said a lot about the development overhaul, but my concern is the entrance and the junction. The officer had photos of the site. I don't know whether the officer can bring up some photos of the site, please. Entrance. See, that entrance, I would have liked to have seen the officer to maybe taking pictures of different directions of that entrance from either direction, because that entrance, even though Essex County Council say there's been no personal injury accidents recorded in the vicinity of the proposed vehicle access, well, at the access, true, but literally within less than 5 metres away, there's been accidents, there's been near misses with buses, there's cars parked opposite this site has had a bus crashed into a car. On the corner of the junction, if you look on your map, councillors, there is a property called Elsie. There's been endless of cars over the years going into that fence, because the fence curves round their boundary there, and you have the rose garden in front of that. There's been accidents in terms of vehicles going into that fence. I'm horrified that Essex County Council say that they have no problem with the entrance and so on. What I would like to hope to have is possibly some improvements, safety improvements to that junction. Maybe you can see the chevrons there going towards Thorrington, coming out of the junction. They are very, very wide, and they go round, and vehicles come round and do cause problems when vehicles coming this way up Wivenhoe Road towards Thorrington, and coming from Thorrington going down Wivenhoe Road towards to Wivenhoe. So that sometimes is a bottleneck. And now we have lots of vehicles from Brett's, the aggregate people, going backwards and forwards using this road, unfortunately, which they shouldn't do, but they do. They do come in and bottom that there. So my concern predominantly is the access in terms of the junction. And I would like to see highway improvements, and I'm disappointed Essex Highways haven't initiated that or done some surveys there. When we all know that Essex County Council say, oh, we visit the site, we have no objection and stuff like that. Well, they just look at a laptop. They just look at Google Earth. I generally don't believe Essex County Council come and have a look at this place. They probably look at a laptop and just have a look. And I don't think it's adequate in my view. There's going to be a serious accident there at some point. A serious accident. There's lots of people have cars, wing mirrors knocked off, buses that come by, hit each other. There's going to be near misses there, and I would like to see some highway improvements on that junction. A lot of residents this end of Wivenhoe Road on the opposite side park their cars there, and because they park off-street parking along there, buses, lorries all come along there, and sometimes there's a bottleneck. You have to wait at the junction. There's different issues there, and I'm disappointed that Essex County Council haven't really considered making some improvements on that junction. Thank you, councillors.
Thank you very much. Any further points to Mr. Faulkner, or wishes to pick any points up?
Yes, just really wanted to come back on the highway elements. Clearly there's been a number of applications on this site. Clearly there is an extant permission on this site for one dwelling, and that would obviously be via the access now before us. Clearly there's been a number of schemes that likewise have obviously been refused by members and obviously dismissed on appeal, but clearly that hasn't been with regard to highway related matters. It's purely obviously been on the form of the development itself. Clearly we have a recommendation from our colleagues at County Hall in terms of highways, and clearly there is a recommendation that they have no objection to the scheme before us. There obviously are conditions in terms of making sure within the site itself there has to be turning facilities, and obviously vehicles will have to leave the site in a forward gear. But clearly they are satisfied from a highway perspective that there isn't a highway objection to the scheme. Just one comment with regard to the comments from the parish council. Clearly there is some weight that should be given to the emerging local plan, and clearly that does show that the wider site that now falls within the settlement area. So in terms of that principle, that is what is actually now emerging. Clearly, in the adopted plan, no, it's outside of the settlement area, but clearly the emerging plan is showing it will be contained within it. And in terms of the comment about the blue land on the site, well, clearly the application before us is to do with the red line area for the free dwellings. So obviously if there is an application for the blue land, that would have to be subject to another planning application and will be determined on its own merits. Thank you, Chairman.
Right. Speakers. Councillor Alexander got his name first.
Thank you, Chair. First and foremost, if I remember correctly, when I joined this committee, they gave me a second-hand high visual coat, but no crystal ball. There is no way that we can see what is in the landowner's mind or the future applications that might be before us. Our role tonight is to see what's here before us and determine that as it's laid out. There are issues here. And one of them is something that comes back from the inspector. The word serious has appeared for the first time, to my knowledge, in one of the inspector's reports. And therefore, I'm going to leave it there, if I may, and hand over to my colleague to fulfil that.
Councillor Colville.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not going to go all the way back to 2013 and the outline application for 5 dwellings, but I will go back briefly to February 16, which is when the first house on this plot was approved, which was the Eco House. I have a concern about this, although obviously it's long gone. It was outside the settlement boundary at the time in both the adopted local plan and the emerging local plan, and it was approved by under delegated authority. I might raise this with the head of planning about whether anything that's outside a settlement boundary should come to the planning committee. But that's obviously a separate thing for tonight. We've heard it was an eco house, and the argument is made that it was approved because it was an eco house. We've had this conversation here before. I know the head of planning will disagree with me, but I think, and as I stated at a previous meeting, the design was a factor in the approval. I know we didn't have a 5-year housing supply at the time. I know it's a sustainable location, but the officer made a great deal of the design of this. It was a stimulating modern design, a contemporary low-level design with living walls and a living roof, because I think the grass went over the roof or whatever. I've read today, revisiting this today, the ecological appraisal got even more carried away. And I didn't mention this at the last committee. It was suggested, and this is a quote, wildflower meadows around the dwelling, the restoration of a small area of orchard, the installation of bird and bat boxes and beehives. These measures would result in a significant net benefit for biodiversity. That never happened, it's never going to happen, but that was there. There was a dissenting voice, which was Alresford Parish Council. They objected, quote, the development of one property could lead to further ribbon development, which is exactly what we're seeing tonight. And I would make the point that, yes, we judge this on its merits, as always, but there is the plot, the remainder of the plot, in the ownership of the applicant, which could easily house another 3 houses. Not something we should consider, perhaps, but that is a reality. I'm going to move on to 2018, and I think 3 or maybe 4 of us were on the planning committee that refused the last 3 houses. The last application for the 3 houses. We settled on policies QL9, QL10, QL11 from the adopted plan, and emerging policy SPL3 in emerging plan, which seems to bring together the 3 QL numbers. QL9, design of new developments, QL11, environmental impacts and compatibility of uses. We turned it down. It went to appeal. The planning inspector turned it down. He didn't agree with QL10, which is why I didn't mention it. He did agree with QL9, and he did agree with QL11. He considered the financial benefit that would come from these 3 houses to the district, and he called it a modest amount of development. I think we're going to hear later that one house can actually be considered immaterial when it comes to our housing needs, or meeting our housing needs. So this would appear to be an immaterial increase of 1 plus 2, which I suppose might be a very modest contribution to our annual housing needs. He went on to say that the modest amount of development would lead to limited, his word, economic benefit to the area. But he did say, as Councillor Alexander said, that he felt the harm was serious. And that is a word that perhaps we don't see in every planning decision, or appeal decision rather. I'm going to quote just a couple of sentences here. The harm I have found to the character and appearance of the area is serious, and in my view that significantly and demonstrably outweighs the benefits of a scheme, when assessed against the policies in the framework, National Policy Planning Framework, taken as a whole. As such, the presumption in favour of sustainable development, as envisaged by the framework, does not apply in this case. There are no other material considerations that indicate a decision other than the one he made. So serious. I appreciate we've got design changes, and yes, I quite accept that they do reduce the seriousness of the harm that the planning inspector identified. And maybe it's no longer serious, perhaps it's just substantial, or some other word between serious and net neutral, or whatever we want to call it. I think that's pretty much what I have to say. I hope it's fairly obvious that I'm opposed to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Harris.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I haven't seen this development before. Obviously, I'm new to the planning committee, and so I haven't been on the site visits as some of my colleagues have, and I'm looking at this with a completely fresh view. I actually, when I saw it, thought, and I've seen the design of these houses that are here, I don't see that there's any serious harm to the layout of the houses. I think it is in keeping. I think that the houses will be behind the mature tree line that's there. So I don't see any particular issues there. I think that the redesign of these houses has been sufficient enough that I think that the previous inspector may well change his view on that. It's now also, which I think is a vital fact, it's now inside the settlement boundary of the emerging plan. We've heard issues with the potential issues with traffic and traffic flow. I mean, in the report, it states about safety elements of this build and making sure that there's no sort of loose gravel, etc., that can be brought out onto the road surface. So it's got to be, I think it's 6 metres back. So they have sort of assessed the situation now. And personally, from 3 houses, I don't see a significant increase in traffic flow to cause any sort of serious harm. As I said, it is behind an existing tree line as well. So, for me, I mean, this is the kind of sort of organic growth in housing that, personally, I prefer. I'd much rather look at schemes like this than, say, a field of 200 houses. I mean, if this scheme it's got beautiful fields and views over the back of all these houses. If there would have been an application for 200 houses, I'd be much more concerned. We're talking 3 houses here within the settlement boundary. I think that the adjustments have been made to the design to keep it, put it in keeping. So I'm finding it difficult to find too much against this. I have obviously listened to the comments that have been made, but personally I'm mindful to approve this application.
Right, Councillor Bray.
Thank you, Chairman. 2 differing points of view coming in there. I'd really just like a little bit of clarification. I think one of the previous councillors mentioned that the word serious was used in an inspector's report, and that's not a common thing to happen. Given that that's the case, and I'm looking at the principal reason as I see it for the inspector's refusal was character, and I'm looking at the 2 pictures, and let's be honest, they're not really in scale. It does seem to me that the roof on the current one just comes down a lot lower than it did on the first one. And I believe when you quoted the height, the actual heights of the properties, we've gone from 8.6 on the original to 8, so a difference of about 1 foot 8, which it doesn't sound that great to me. So, given that the inspector had used words like serious when referring to character, what did officers feel made it acceptable and able to recommend approval this time? Because it's not clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. With regard to that, I would refer members to paragraph 6.15 and 6.16 of the recommendation. And I'll just quote what was stated by the inspector, and it just highlights here. And basically what he said, the development of the site with 3 substantial dwellings, and obviously the word substantial obviously springs to mind, would fail to respect the close-knit urban grain of the west, to the west, and would interrupt the established rhythm of development in the area. Well, clearly, one of the key changes here is obviously the urban grain has been condensed here because obviously the dwellings, in terms of the plot configuration, has been made a lot tighter. Yes, I accept the comment that obviously the applicant does own a wider land parcel here, which is obviously shown as blue land on this plan here. But clearly, I would repeat that obviously any application to put houses on that piece of land would have to be subject to a separate application and will be given due consideration if and when it is submitted. And in terms of the scale and form of it, well, I would, just looking at the articulation of these 2 street scenes, I would obviously point to the fact obviously they've got quite clear 2-storey projections on these. Obviously higher eaves levels, particularly with regard to the plot at the western end of the site. This has significantly been scaled back. There clearly are 1.5-storey chalets with rooms in the roof, whereas I would read these particular dwellings, while in part you could read that as a cottage or rooms in the roof, there clearly are fully 2-storey dwellings, so there has been a scaling back, and the scheme has also been condensed in terms of the site coverage to make it more uniform with the rest of Wivenhoe Road in terms of plot widths. And clearly it is set behind, as Councillor Harris rightly said, there is quite a distinct and clear tree line to Wivenhoe Road that sits in front of this site. So what we'll actually read from the road frontage is relatively limited here. Yes, clearly in winter months there will be views through to the site, but particularly in summer months you would probably only get glimpses of these dwellings. Moving on to paragraph 6.16, the inspector also identified it talks about the greater physical relationship of the development area, and it says, I quote, "The existing properties along Wivenhoe Road and in the area generally have been developed in a close proximity to each other." Well, clearly, as I said, that has been a distinct change with this scheme before us tonight. they were more widespread across the site, more spread out, which was clearly not in kilter with the rest of Wivenhoe Road. We've obviously reduced site widths, very much chalet, bungalows, a mix of dwellings, but clearly this is looked to be more uniform which is on the street. And obviously officers believe, in terms of the more uniform spacing, that's also referred in that paragraph, will be more in rhythm with the street. And obviously officers of the mind that does overcome the previous reasons for refusal quoted by the inspector. Thank you, Chairman.
Right. I don't have any speakers to date. Anybody? Yes, Councillor Colthorpe.
Thank you, Chairman. I listened to the officer's comments, and I do accept, as I said earlier, that this reduces the harm that the planning inspector identified. But QL9, which is one of the reasons we used as a committee, it's one of the reasons he used in his dismissal, was that developments are supposed to make a positive contribution and are to protect and enhance local character. This is doing less harm, but it's not making a positive contribution, and it's not protecting and enhancing, in my opinion. Other members of the committee will have different opinions. This is what we're here for. I think this does slightly less harm than previously, but it still should be refused. Thank you.
Right. Anybody willing to test it then? And yes, Councillor Harris.
But I take on board what Councillor Cawthorne has said. I actually think that it's, any build to a greenfield area is going to do somewhat harm, arguably. But I do think that this actually enhances the area for housing. I think that the design of it and it's in keeping. It's behind the tree line. As I said before, I don't think that it's going to cause a massive amount of traffic increase there. So I would like to propose approval of this scheme, please.
Right. Do I have a seconder for approval? At this stage, I don't. So are there any counter propositions?
I'd like to propose refusal, please, on the grounds of certainly QL9 and possibly QL11 again, and SPL3 in the emerging policies, which I believe is a catch-all, but I could be wrong for those QL policies. Thank you.
Do I have a seconder for that proposal? I do. Thank you. Now, knowing what's going to happen to the vote, if it's refused, that's all right. If it, well, let's take the vote. That's the easiest way. Those in favour, please show on refusal. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I haven't voted. I'll abstain on this one. And those against? It is refused. Now, because it's refused against the officer's recommendation, I think Councillor Cawthorne has given us QL9, QL11, and probably SPL3 in the new plan. So those are 3 reasons that we would argue that one, and therefore, if the proposers and seconders are happy with that and don't wish to add anything else, they are, then this application has been refused. Thank you. Then move to the last one on the agenda this evening. It is planning application 1901-353. This is for an outline for land adjacent to or part of Wisteria House, Back Lane Back Lane East, we've got to be precise on that, Great Bromley. And we've got Mrs. Lang to produce this one, or speak on this one.
Thank you, Chairman. So the final member before committee tonight is for Wisteria House, Back Lane East, Great Bromley. The application is before members at the request of Councillor Scott, and the application seeks outline permission with all matters reserved for the erection of one self-build bungalow. The application site currently comprises the side garden area associated with the property known as Wisteria House. It's located on the northern side of Back Lane East within the parish of Great Bromley, but the site can be better described as being located within Hare Green. Here's an aerial view of the site and a wider area view just to show you the context of the site in relation to the dwellings nearby and the open field beyond to the rear. So just some photos of the site now. This is the view along Chase Road West, and that's a view of the existing property Wisteria House. That's a view of the application site itself, so that's the side garden area of Wisteria House and the existing outbuildings within the site. That's a view looking east towards the donor property Wisteria House, and that's a view of some of the outbuildings within the garden area at the moment. And again, another view in the same direction, just showing you the forward-sited garage serving Wisteria House. That's a view of the existing access. And here's a wider view just to show the orientation of the property Wisteria House itself and how it's angled within the plot. So kind of face Chase Road West and towards the corner of the junction. That's a wider view again, looking east back towards Wisteria House. And that's looking down Back Lane East again with the application site to the right-hand side of the photo. That's a view from Meadow Close, so that's a small road off of Back Lane East with the application site again to the right of the photo. So as I said, the application is made an outline with all matters reserved. This indicative block plan shows how the site would be accessed from a new access from Back Lane East and how the proposed bungalow and garage could be positioned within the site. This is a floor plan. Again, this would just be indicative because all matters are reserved. It's noted that the application description describes a single garage, whereas the indicative plan shows an adjoining cart lodge appearing as a double on here, but this would be dealt with at the reserved matter stages of the application. So of particular relevance in this instance is the previous refusal for a very similar scheme under planning application reference 19-00674, again outlined with all matters reserved. That application is currently subject to an appeal. It's quite at the early stages, so the decision would be a few months down the line on that. The application was refused as the development was considered contrary to the environmental and social objectives of sustainable development, and officers are recommending refusal again this evening on the same grounds. So the agent has submitted additional information to try and address the previous reasons for refusal. I've included those on the slide. So it includes an urban landscape analysis plan, a site photo analysis slide, and a supporting statement detailing access to services and addressing the landscape impact. This is a photo showing the site in the far ground there. So that would be a view across the field from behind the application site itself. So this is a plan just to demonstrate the location of the application site in regards to the adjacent settlements. Great Bromley is the parish that it falls within, but as you can see, the settlement boundary is over sort of 2 kilometres away from the application site, and Freighting is to the south, but again a considerable distance away. That's the slide. So just to go through the representations, on the update sheet, because they weren't available at the time of the agenda. Great Bromley Parish Council raised no objection, and we've also had one letter of support with regards to the self-build dwelling supply for the district. Turning to the merits of the application, as stated, the site lies outside the development boundary as defined within both the adopted and the draft local plans, and it falls to be considered against the sustainable strands within the MPPF. Officers don't have any issues in terms of the economic strand, but the social strand, similarly with the previous refusal, it's located within Hare Green, which has no defined settlement boundary due to its small size and lack of services and amenities. Great Bromley is identified as a village within the adopted local plan and a smaller rural settlement within the emerging local plan. The application site is located approximately 2 kilometres away from the edge of Great Bromley settlement. These smaller villages are considered to be the least sustainable locations for growth, and there is concern that encouraging development in these areas will only serve to increase the number of people having to rely on cars to go about their daily lives. Officers note that there is a bus service to Colchester in a short walking distance from the application site, but this in isolation is not considered sufficient to support new dwellings in this locality. Regardless of the council's housing land supply, the application fails to meet the social strand. Moving on to the environmental impact, again this formed a previous reason for refusal. In this instance, I'll go back to the wider aerial view slide. So there are dwellings to the east and south of the site, so we can't describe the site itself as isolated, but it is bound by open fields to the north and northwest. The vehicular access is via Back Lane East. Wisteria House is positioned within its plot in a southeasterly orientation, appearing to address Chase Road West. With no other dwellings on this side of Back Lane East, it takes on a very different character. The application site currently comprises the side garden area of Wisteria House and contains a number of small domestic outbuildings and greenhouse structures, but the semi-rural character is not compromised by these structures. The southern side of Back Lane East is characterised by detached bungalows, so there's no objection to a bungalow on this site as it would appear in character. Nonetheless, the development itself is considered to represent an unplanned advance within a semi-rural location. Whilst it's recognised that existing vegetation around the site and the single-storey scale of the dwelling would minimise the wider landscape harm, the introduction of an additional dwelling in this location fronting this part of the lane would be out of character. Furthermore, if approved, development could set a harmful precedent for the continuation of ribbon development along this side of Back Lane East, further eroding the semi-rural character of the area. So the provision of a single dwelling would make an immaterial contribution to the delivery of housing in the district, and this would be in a location that is highlighted as one of the least sustainable locations for growth. With regards to the self-build and custom-build element of the property, the supporting information provided with the application states that the applicant have registered their interest on our self-build register. Draft Policy LP7 of the emerging local plan aims to satisfy the requirements set out within legislation, but there is no equivalent in the adopted plan as this predates the Act, the Self-Build Act. Due to the location of the site a considerable distance from the defined Great Bromley settlement boundary and the settlement designation itself being a village and a small rural settlement, the application fails to meet the criteria set out in Policy LP7 regardless. So, regardless of the need identified through our self-build register or the merits of the application in relation to that draft policy, the self-build aspect of the proposal is not considered to constitute material consideration that warrants a departure from the local plan. The status of Policy LP7 means that the refusal based on this policy is not required. There's no tree or landscape harm identified, and landscaping details could be secured at the reserve matters stages if members are minded to approve. Officers are happy that there's sufficient space on the site for appropriate access, turning and parking in line with the requirements of the Council's adopted standards, and Essex County Council Highway Authority raised no objections subject to conditions. Again, officers are happy that sufficient space on site to achieve an internal layout and separation distances that would not detract from residential amenities, and it could provide a garden that accords with policy standards. So should members be mindful to approve, it's also pointed out that the application is accompanied by UU to secure a financial contribution towards RAMS mitigation and improvements to the play area at Hare Green Recreation Ground. So just to conclude, the development is considered to represent an unsustainable form of development due to the social and environmental harm identified. The poor social sustainability credentials of the site and adverse impact on the character of the area outweigh any economic benefits of the scheme. There are no exceptional circumstances that warrant approval of the development for the site for a self-build dwelling, and the application is recommended for refusal.
Thank you very much. Now then, for public speaking, we have a member of the public speaking in favour of the application, Mr. Bill Marshall, if he's with us. Welcome, sir, and get yourself settled and get the microphone live, and then you've got 3 minutes, sir.
Okay, good evening. I'd like to try and persuade you to support this and pass it as an approval for this self-build bungalow. The applicants are on the self-build register, and currently there are 54 people on that self-build register. This shows the demand that is in tendering for self-build properties. As you know, the adopted local plan 2007 is 12 years out of date and has limited weight, and the emerging local plan has not been found sound, and no date has been set for the resumption of Section 1. Section 2 is reliant on Section 1, so we're in a terrible place. The emerging local plan, therefore, has very limited weight, as was confirmed by the Planning Policy Department in September. The National Planning Policy is the current fallback and is to be consulted, and it was derived from previous National Planning Policy frameworks and the government's Housing White Paper Fixing Our Broken Housing Market, February 2017, and also the Self-Build Act 2016. The White Paper encourages local authorities to have policies in place that support the development of small windfall sites, and great weight should be given to self-build plots, and applications should be treated positively and timely. There are precedents. 01575 has been approved. That's a self-build plot. Approved on appeal is 18649. 1900676 been approved. And most importantly, 1702143 was brought before the committee on the 6th of March 2018, and on the Head of Planning's recommendation it was unanimously approved, and it is relevant. The White Paper recommends the avoidance of appeals, and finally, tendering has not met its 5-year land supply of 863, and even one would knock this down. This application makes better use of the land. Thank you very much.
Now, carrying on with the speakers, Councillor Gary Scott is who called this application in.
Was that 5, Councillor Alexander? Thank you. I'd like to thank councillors and officers for listening to the application tonight and for me calling it in. I brought it forward to the planning committee because I think it has a positive impact for the area in terms of Hare Green. Bromley Parish Council is identified as the least sustainable location for growth, both adopting the emerging local plans. But if you look at like Great Bromley as a whole, as a parish, you have Bromley Heath, Bromley Village, Balls Green, Hare Green. And I know that in Great Bromley, there's been building of houses in Colchester Road up in Bromley Heath. There's been building in Freighting Road in Balls Green. And there's been development in Ardley Road in Great Bromley. And recently, there's some building going on now on the corner of Mary Lane North. So there's small-scale developments that have been going on in Great Bromley. The applicant wants to downsize. They live in Wisteria House, they're retired, and they want to downsize. I see this as a double positive because they want to build a bungalow next to their property at their own at the moment, freeing up a family home. This will send in a young family in to Wisteria Cottage, and then keep Mr. and Mrs. Owens to stay in Great Bromley, Hare Green, for the rest of their days in their house, the new house. So that's the important, is they want to downsize and also free up another house. The officer's report says there's limited range of services and amenities, but not far from here, off the map there, is Elmston Market. Predominantly loads of people in Hare Green travel to Elmston Market to use the petrol station, to use Budgeons, to use the other services there. Having additional property, in my view, won't have a problem. I don't think it have a major effect on this. People are going to use vehicles in coming out of Hare Green anyway. It says, and then also in the report, it says unplanned advanced urbanisation. Well, if you look at the lane itself, you've got Meadow Close, you've got around about 46 properties in Meadow Close, you've got Back Lane East, there's about 10 properties down there. You have Chase West going round to Mary Lane South. There's quite a lot of properties there. This is probably, in Parish or Great Bromley, the most urban part of the village. So I can understand the other areas are more rural, but this is predominantly the most urban part of the village. So semi-rural character with severe impact. Well, I don't think it will have a severe impact on having one bungalow built in the garden of Wisteria Cottage. And to go down the rat lane, you get to the A120, you can't go through there. So a lot of walkers go through there. A lot of people walk around and walk to the playing field. So I think it's sustainable on foot around Hare Green. But predominantly, if they want services to go to the doctors and shops and so forth, they would have to use vehicles or public transport. I think overall it's a positive thing. Mr. and Mrs. Owens want to stay in the area. They want to stay in Hare Green. They want to downsize. The applicant has accommodated the previous comments from the officer on the previous application. They have been accommodating. They have changed the application accordingly to officers' comments, which I think is a positive. And I don't think it will have a negative effect on the area. In terms of the fronting of the lane, the character, I don't think it would change. One dwelling, I don't think it will have an impact. I don't think it will set a precedent. I think it will finish it off there because if you look down the lane, there's a row of oak trees along there, and I suspect they've got a load of TPOs on, and this will just finish up nicely, fit in this part of the in the road. I can't say any more really, and I really support it. Essex Highways finally have said something which is I agree with. They don't object. It's amazing that they don't seem to do it when you want them to do it the right way, but when something you know is right, they are right. So obviously someone from Essex County Council must have turned up and had a look. But overall, Hare Green is the larger part of Great Bromley. I know it doesn't have a settlement boundary, but it's predominantly more urban than the other parts, and I don't think this will have a negative effect. And I'm hoping councillors would recommend approval for this application. I have to say, when the officer said there's no amenities, there's a school not far. There are 3 pubs in the parish of Great Bromley, not far from Freighting, where there is yet another pub, and there's Elmston Market. So there are facilities, albeit by car, but it's within a mile or 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Scott. very nearly within your permitted 5 minutes. Very nearly, yeah.
Never has been.
Oh, no, I'm going to complete it first before I make any announcement. The applicant, agent or representative, I'm not sure quite which, but Mr. Michael Calder is here. I'm not sure in which role, but he's invited to come and speak to us. Right.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Michael Calder from Phase 2 Planning, speaking on behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Owens. This is a revised application amended to fully address officers' previous reasons for refusing an application for a bungalow. The applicants simply wish to build a sustainable retirement bungalow for themselves, wholly within their garden. There are no objections from local residents or statutory consultees, but support from the parish. Whilst grateful, the applicant was unaware of Mr. Marshall's letter or his support this evening. Officers agree the application should be determined in accordance with the MPPF. Accordingly, the presumption in favour of sustainable development applies and should be determined by way of the planning balance. There are 3 strands of sustainability: social, economic and environmental. There's no disagreement between us over the economic strand. On the social strand, officers agree the proposal will deliver a new home to meet the needs of existing residents and free up a family home, which will support existing local services. But officers conclude that the occupants would be too reliant on car usage. However, the site is less than 2 kilometres walking distance from the village hall, primary school and several bus routes that connect Hare Green to Harwich, Frinton, Clacton and Walton, as well as Colchester. Further, the MPPF requires a more flexible approach to car travel in rural areas, and this self-build bungalow will be no more reliant on the car than many other parts of the district. With over 150 homes, Hare Green is larger than several other local villages with a settlement boundary and has similar access to the same facilities. Withholding development because Hare Green doesn't have a settlement boundary restricts the organic growth needed to sustain the vitality of a community this size and is contrary to the MPPF. Mr and Mrs Owens have registered on the Council's statutory self-build register without success. The Council has a waiting list of 62 applicants but has only approved 7 self-build homes, without any being removed from the list. This proposal will assist the Council deliver its statutory duty and remove 1 entry from the list. This contributes significantly to the social strand and is a material contribution. We'll just add that policy LP7 is of limited weight because of the stage of the local plan in the process. On the environmental strand, officers conclude that the development would have an unacceptable impact on the surrounding area and set a precedent for development further along the lane. However, the site's contained by robust hedgerow boundaries, so there will be no wider visual impacts. The bungalow is fully within the existing building line on the north side of the road, so will not lead to a precedent for further development along the lane. The design amendments are made following the previous refusal include only 1 vehicular entrance, a single garage, and the bungalow has been reduced in size by 10%. Therefore, in weighing the planning balance, we believe there are no adverse impacts, and certainly none which would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of this self-build dwelling. So the presumption in favour and the tilted balance remains engaged for this development in this location. Officers have not given the delivery of a self-build dwelling due regard in the planning balance, and it's our opinion that if they had, the balance would fall towards permission being granted, and we'd urge you to support this application. I'd just like to thank members for listening and for the ward member for calling this to this committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Before we start the debate, and I've already building up a list of people who wish to speak, this is just a point of information for Mr. Marshall, who spoke about the question of the planning state at the present moment. Only today, I understand, the inspector is now satisfied with the answers that he got back. He set a number of questions, and he's now satisfied with the answers that he's got back, and he's announced that he will be continuing with the examination starting on the 14th of January. So that's just a point of information.
No.
Yes.
No.
Doesn't have any bearing, I would suggest, at this stage. Right, I've got a list of people. Speakers. Councillor Bray.
Thank you, Chairman. It's interesting. We find ourselves in an unusual position. We have an application recommended for refusal that's supported by the members of the public, it's supported by the parish council, it's supported by the district councillors, and I have to say it's likely to be supported by me, despite the fact that it's outside of a boundary, because of course this village doesn't have one, which is a bit strange. Realistically, if we therefore said it's outside the boundary, we would have to say that any village this size would never ever have another building put on it, and that seems silly. The plot, to me, I'm looking at the plot, it's staring at me right in the face, and I just can't see anything wrong at all with putting a bungalow there, particularly given it's for the people who live in the house next door and they are going to release a larger property for family, a point well made by one of the district councillors, and particularly as it's self-built, which is something we should be supporting. I just cannot see anything wrong with this, to the point where if nobody else does, I'm quite happy to propose approval. Thank you.
Right, Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I find it quite astonishing that this is actually being turned down, to be honest. I was really pleased to hear the agent talk about organic growth, because as I mentioned in the previous application, I much prefer organic growth rather than mass house building. And I'd like to sort of commend the agent, actually. I thought that was a first-class presentation, and he absolutely ticks all the boxes for me in why we should be accepting this. And I really can't see any issues with this whatsoever. My only concern is, what are we going to do with the fantastic looking flowers that were in the garden that we all saw today? Because they were astonishingly good. It puts my garden to shame. But apart from that, no, I would second this and ask for this to be approved. Thank you.
Councillor Alexander.
Thank you, Chair. First and foremost, on our arrival, I was quite taken back by the warmth that was shown to the family and the support that they held from the parish council to the local residents, who seemed to turn out in force to support them. Them being dragged into the garden, us all to look at the site, and the freedom that we felt while we were there, and the warmth and the welcome they gave us, and I thank you very much for doing that. Sitting in this very room tonight, there was one amongst us who recently had lived in that village, or very near to that village, if he didn't live in the village itself, who had got planning permission, and they were way outside the settlement boundary. And when it was brought up about policy LP7, the self-built and custom-built homes, I thought I might just have a wee look on that, if I may, and I'd like to quote some things back. The first paragraph states that the council will encourage the provision of opportunities of constructing self-built and custom-built homes as part of the mixed housing. In the second paragraph, it goes on to say the council will also consider on their merits proposal for self-built and custom-built homes on land outside the settlement boundaries, but not replacements of the existing dwellings. Now, if my understanding today, if I've got this correct, that what's there is going to stay, and this is being built supernumerary to that property, so that will have no effect on the final build here. This is a part of this enormous garden. Sorry, guys, but I really don't see I'm in any position but to approve this. So if there is a recommendation for approval, I'm quite happy to do just that.
Right. Well, as I understand it at the present moment, we'll have further discussions, but we have a proposal for acceptance and a seconder for that already. Further comments? Has anybody wish to comment anything? Yes, I'll ask the solicitor.
In this unusual situation, that we're in. Normally, as officers, we'd be asking you for reasons to support any refusal, and the same applies if it's the other way round. So we do still need the reasons for the decision. So, because that's the law.
Where are you going to put them?
Chair, point of order, please.
Well, the reference must be to the support on self-build.
The point of order is that I have approved sometimes in the past, not often, but sometimes in the past, against the officer's recommendation of refusal. Never before have we been asked this. Why have we been asked this tonight? The approval is simple, is that it is here, gravelled in stone, in our own policies of, I don't like using the ensuing 2013-33 local plan unless I feel it is fitting. I believe in this case this would be fitting to this, as the other one is almost extinct to this, and hopefully this will then clock in by the time that this is up and running and we get this settled. So I'm taking that direct from that.
The reason you might not have been asked for it before is because I've not been here before. So that's the first point. The second point is that because the committee is making a decision, it requires reasons to support the decision. I'm not asking you to go into detail as to the length that would normally be in the planning committee report, but you still need reasons to support your decision. So if you would summarise those, as the chairman has highlighted, it makes reference to a specific policy, they would be the reasons that support your decision. Any decision that a committee makes must be supported by reasons, and I apologise if that's not been brought to your attention before.
Councillor Colthorpe, do you wish to add anything?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. A possible reason for going against the officer's recommendation, in my opinion, is that I don't agree with the characterisation that it makes an immaterial contribution to the housing numbers. I think it should be viewed as a windfall site that makes a very modest contribution, or a modest contribution rather, to the housing numbers.
Yep, agreed.
Right. Then I'm left to take a vote, I think. So those in favour of acceptance of the application, please show. And that will be 100%. Thank you, councillors. And that completes our agenda this evening, so we close the meeting.
Sorry, Chairman, could I just come back to you? We're going to need to agree some conditions to go along with the approval. So officers recommend the 3 standard time limits that would be for a reserve matters application, and then possibly in this instance the removal of permitted development rights for fences along that rear boundary, or and the removal of permitted development rights for outbuildings. And just to clarify the description, we can secure the single-storey scale of the development as well. Is everyone happy with that?
Yep.
That's all sounds good, yep.
Yes.
So that would be 3, 4, 5. That would be 6 conditions in total.
Right. As I'd said just now, that completes this evening's meeting. Thank you very much. Thank the officers for their time and your attendance.